I just want to welcome everybody. This is Holly Lee. I'm the Director of Advancement, and Samantha is going to get going in a few minutes. I just want to thank you for joining in on your lunch hour. We will record this if for some reason you, get called away. It will be up on the Sycamore YouTube channel, or if you happen to have some friends and colleagues that missed it today, we will have that available. I will be in the chat if you have any questions, and Samantha will go ahead and give us a great presentation.
Great, thank you so much, Holly.
Yeah.
As people continue to pop in, Holly, are you able to admit them from your end, or do I need to keep my eyes on that?
I think I am. People seem to be just popping into me, so maybe I can't.
Okay, so there's one now. Can you?
I don't see it.
Okay, so I'll keep my eyes open for those. Okay. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here today. We'll be talking about stress management, which seems like kind of a vague, broad category, but we're going to narrow in on what stress looks like for gifted kids and how we can help support them as their parents. And I think this is especially timely now as we've encountered an unprecedented number of stressors over the past year. Here we go. All right, so an overview of stress and resilience. First of all, some stress is normal and healthy. And so I want to share with you this Yerkes-Dodson law that tells us if we don't have any stress at all, performance is pretty low. We have a tendency to experience apathy, not have much motivation if there's really zero stress. And so a little bit of stress can actually optimize performance. It can help us be alert and engaged and invested. But then there comes a point where if there is too much stress, that performance starts to be impaired, and it can transform into anxiety and can become problematic. So let's talk a little bit about the definition of stress. There used to be some debate over whether the word stress referred to something external or something internal. And in fact, there's been kind of an evolution of how we use this word. So back in the 1940s, 1950s, you never ever would hear someone say the sentence, "I am stressed," because that word wasn't used to describe an internal feeling. The stress was thought of as a stressor from the outside. And so now we kind of tend to use that word for both external and internal, and that we have these external stressors that put stress on us, and then we feel stressed. So there's been a little bit of a language change with that, which I find interesting. But a basic working definition that I think we can use today is to think about when the demands outweigh the resources. And there are a variety of ways to consider this. So we can think of this numerically, right? So in terms of finances, when there's income as the resource and expenses as the demands. And if the expenses are higher than the income, that is stress, right? We can also think about it in terms of time. If there are demands on our time that take up more time than we have, that is stress. But I also want us to think about maybe emotional resources and emotional demands. And there can be too much going on. There can just be a lot of stressors coming at us from a lot of different angles, and we might not have all of the coping tools or emotional resources to manage that. So let's keep this definition in mind as we and let's think about the impacts of stress. So And this is for kids and adults. There's a lot of physical manifestation of stress. We can feel it in our bodies in a variety of different ways. A lot of this has to do with how the fight or flight response impacts our body. A lot of it has to do with muscle tension that can create a variety of different experiences that you see here. We can also see a lot of behavioral or emotional changes, especially with kids, outbursts or meltdowns. And okay, let's face it, adults can have outbursts and meltdowns too. And in kids, you might see regression of developmental milestones. So a kid who was solidly potty trained might start to have more accidents than they did before. For an older kid, if they had really solidified their organizational skills and now that's kind of falling apart, not a surprise when they're under a lot of stress. Kids are more on edge, maybe not sleeping as well. We can also think about the narrowing. Stress kind of creates a narrowing. So their comfort zone might be smaller. They might be less flexible in their thinking and a little less able to adapt. It's really important for us as adults to tune in to these changes that our kids might experience because they don't always tell us that they're feeling stressed. And in fact, as we're going to talk about soon, they don't always know right away. They don't necessarily have the self-awareness and are not tuned in to what's going on. I also want to talk about the difference between acute stress versus chronic stress. So acute stress is kind of those time-limited stressors that happen to us. You know, we're stuck in traffic, or we get a bill that we didn't expect, or we have an argument with somebody. Those momentary stressors create kind of a fight, flight, or freeze response in our body. So our sympathetic nervous system kicks in. This is an adaptive survival mode. So if we think about back to caveman days, if we had a saber-toothed tiger attacking, our body is going to transition into this fight or flight or freeze response. And that gets us prepared to deal with that threat. So the amygdala senses the threat, turns on these stress hormones, which creates a lot of changes in our bodies. Our digestion slows down because we don't need to spend our resources on digestion in that moment. We just need to survive. Our heart starts pumping a lot harder, diverts blood to our major internal organs and major muscle groups so that we can run. Pupils dilate. There are a number of things that happen in the body that get us prepared to deal with that emergency situation. And then what's supposed to happen is the parasympathetic nervous system or arm of the autonomic nervous system kicks in, and that brings us back to baseline. So this stress response is kind of like, we can almost think of it as a gas pedal, kind of energizing us, getting us ready to deal with this threat. And then the parasympathetic nervous system or the relaxation response is kind of like the brake pedal, which slowly brings us back down to homeostasis or where we normally are physiologically. The problem is with chronic stress, we don't get that return to baseline. We are still in fight, flight, or freeze constantly. So when there are recurring stressors over and over and over and over again, we get what's called this allostatic load. So allostasis is our body's attempt to manage the stress, but it can get to be too much. When we don't have that release from the physiological charged up status, then the body has to work harder to function. And there are all kinds of chronic health effects from that, including diabetes, because one of the things that happens in a fight, flight, or freeze response is we release glucose into the bloodstream so that we can fuel the cells, so that we can develop insulin resistance. Obesity can be an issue because we tend to hold on to more fat when the cortisol stays in our body like that all the time. And other chronic health effects include cognitive decline, all kinds of things. And then here we are in this point in time in our lives when we can't seem to get a break from these repeated chronic stressors. And so what do we do when it continues to come at us and come at us? And really it puts a lot on us to have to improve our coping game, have to really make sure that our coping skills are strong. We're going to talk about what resilience looks like. Before we jump into that, I want us to take a few slow, deep breaths together. Yes, really, right now, all together. Even if your video is not on, even if you're watching the recording, I'm not going to know if you're doing it or not, but we're going to do it together. I promise, it's worth it. So get yourself settled into your seat. You might choose to close your eyes or look down. And just breathe in slowly. And breathe out.
Booth, co-founder of the Kibo Code, thank you for sharing your email with us so that we can
breathe
share this
in.
valuable information.
And out. And then I'll invite you to lift one arm and just stretch it up high, get a good stretch, maybe reach over to the opposite side and let that gently release down. Lift up your other arm, stretch it up high, over to the side and release it down. Lift your shoulders, roll them back, and then gently let them release. And maybe get the wiggles out. Okay, so now that we've reset, let's continue on. Resilience. The definition is the ability to deal with the effects of stress and bounce back. But there's an interesting point about resilience. We normally think of it as sequential, that resilience happens after stress. There's kind of a temporal relationship there. Stress happens first, resilience happens later. But it's interesting that we can actually front load our resilience to be better prepared for stress. And so resilience serves as a buffer to stress. And I like to talk to kids about it as almost like a gas tank analogy, that we have this resilience tank and we can fill our resilience tank with coping skills, with self-care, with meaningful and fun and positive experiences. And then we are better prepared to meet those stressors when they come along. And if we get a little depleted in our resilience tank, we can fill it back up with more coping skills, more self-care, more positive experiences. I didn't mean to skip over this, but the factors that impact resilience are a warm family environment, as well as support outside the family. So research has shown that those two factors are really important to resilience. And I want to talk about stress among gifted kids. It is a little bit different. And first I wanted to share this image here. I don't know if you guys can see all of that. Does it look too small? So up here we have what my friends think I do, what my mom thinks I do, what the media thinks I do, what my teachers think I do, what I think I do, and then what I really do. And what I love about this image is it just kind of reminds us that these sweet babies are just kids and just want to hug a dog sometimes. All right, so getting into a little bit more about how gifted kids are unique. First of all, asynchronous development. I think a lot of times when we think of the asynchronous development in gifted kids, we are thinking about academic domains, that maybe they progress faster in math than they do in humanities, or maybe they show proficiency and talent in creative ways, and that's developing at a different pace than other academic domains. But I'd like us to also consider this asynchronicity between intellectual development and social and emotional development. And so what we find is that intellectual development of gifted kids tends to outpace their emotional and social development. So their intellectual or cognitive age or cognitive development might be more mature or older, so to speak, than their chronological age. However, the social and emotional development might actually be right at their chronological age, or it might even be below. And so this is an important thing for us to keep in mind, especially when we're thinking about how they're impacted by stress. They also have unique social and emotional characteristics. Gifted kids are known to be perfectionistic and maybe have more fear of failure than other kids, have intense emotionality, can be overexcitable in a number of ways, have high empathy and are very sensitive, might have a strong need for justice, crave deep connection. And so there can be a very rich internal emotional world going on. However, despite this internal emotional world, they tend to process analytically. They tend to process in their heads. They might even prefer to process cognitively. And because of this, they might not notice the emotional cues and the physiological cues that could tell them maybe something's not right here, maybe they don't like what's happening. And because there's this mismatch of the intense emotion plus the preference for intellectual reasoning, it can sometimes feel like pressure to hide their emotions and pressure not to share what's going on. And sometimes all of that is so well practiced that they don't even notice it. They might not have the self-awareness to see. So it's not necessarily a deliberate, hey, I'm feeling all this stuff and I'm keeping it from you. It's just they don't have the awareness that all of this is going on until they have a very severe headache or until they haven't been sleeping well for 3 nights or 2 weeks. And then you start to wonder, okay, what's going on here? The other thing is that gifted kids tend to be reluctant to ask for help. They often want to appear that they have it all together. They want to have it all figured out. And they don't want other people to worry about them. So even when they do have the self-awareness that they're struggling, they might not ask for help. So let's talk a little bit about that emotional intensity piece. If we think about the internal world of the gifted kid, they tend to process information quickly, deeply, and then they move on to the next thing. They have a lot of experience with achieving mastery easily, not having to work very hard for that mastery, just kind of arriving at it. The problem is emotions don't work that way. You can't just achieve an emotion regulation and move right on. And so on top of a distressing feeling, then they add the frustration of having the feeling, and then the more frustration of not being able to logically explain it, perhaps, and then maybe embarrassment of displaying it in front of other people. Then it just compounds. This emotion is compounded and it's longer lasting because of all of this additional processing. And then they analyze and scrutinize the situation because the intellectualizing is more comfortable to pinpoint what happened and maybe correct or perfect the situation. So there's a lot of maybe verbalizing, a lot of intellectualizing, not a lot of connection with the emotion. But emotions linger on in the body. Even when we want them to be gone, even when we think they're gone, sometimes they really hang around, especially if we've been caught up in our heads and not feeling the emotion. So we can help kids understand that their feelings are important data. And I think that really appeals to gifted kids when they learn to think about their emotions as a piece of the analysis. They can factor emotions into this whole intellectualizing process, but first they have to connect to it. They have to sometimes just sit with it, get to know that feeling, even though it does not feel good at all, and tune into it and really see what it has to say. So feelings can be this valuable source of information, but we want them to know you can't regulate it when you're pushing it away. Regulating emotions is about tuning in and then making a decision about what to do with it. So instead of pushing it away and instead of intellectualizing, it's helpful for gifted kids to use emotion-focused coping and body-based or mind-body strategies for coping. Now, this doesn't mean that they can't also do the problem solving. So I'm not saying throw problem solving out the window. Problem solving is very helpful. Being logical, being reasonable, being rational, all of that is very helpful. But these are the things they might need extra help with. Sitting with the feeling, breathing through it, expressing their emotion non-verbally, so maybe some artistic expressions of emotion can be really helpful. The body-based strategies are so helpful for kids who might actually be a little disconnected from their bodies. Large muscle movement is so helpful, especially for little kids, but this also carries throughout the lifespan. That physical exercise is a really adaptive way of coping. Physically releasing anger in safe ways, sometimes this can be a little controversial. I think if you are confident that your kid can be safe with this, it's okay to punch a pillow. It's okay to maybe throw a pillow onto the bed. If no one's getting hurt, then you can think about how that might work in your home or your family. Mind-body strategies like relaxation techniques such as deep breathing and yoga and mindfulness exercises are really helpful ways for kids to connect with themselves. And that's really the point here. The intellectualizing can disconnect them from their bodies and from their emotions. So what can we do as parents? What are some of the things that we can do to help support our kids, especially through stressful times? The number one thing we can do is to show up for them, is to be available, be present, and really make sure that we're there for them, which can be hard during a global pandemic and all of the things going on when we are also experiencing our own stress. So we might be kind of disconnecting from things sometimes, but it is so critical for our kids. For us to put down the phone, put down the laptop, make eye contact, and stay in the moment with them. Unconditional love is critical. It is so important for them to know that no matter how much they push our buttons, no matter how many rules they break, no matter what happens, our love is still there for them. That's not the same as unconditional approval. That doesn't mean that we approve of them punching their brother in the stomach, but we love them even when they punch their brother in the stomach, and they need to hear that. They need the explicit verbal statement, I'm disappointed in what you did, and I love you no matter what. They really need to hear that. Another thing is listen when they talk. And sometimes this is hard because they come to us at the most inconvenient times, when we're busy with other things, and sometimes that is a little bit of a test on us. They want to drop a little nugget to see if we'll show up for them. And so we need to be prepared to be flexible because they will come at the most inconvenient times. And answer questions honestly and with reassurance. And I want to be clear about what I mean about reassurance. It's really important that our reassurance is truthful. We can't say to them, I promise everything will be okay, because that's not necessarily a promise that we can keep. And they see through that, and they know that, and then they don't trust us. But what we can say is, we are safe right now. Your parents, we are working very hard to keep us safe, to keep us healthy. We're doing everything that we can to keep us safe. And if something else comes along, I know that we are good problem solvers, and I know that we can move forward together and we will take care of you. So the reassurance, it's really important that that be honest and true, and making promises that you know you can keep. It's also important to validate their perspectives and their emotions. And again, we might not agree with that. So this does not equate to approval. We might not agree with their perspective, but we can still validate it. You know, when they might be talking about an argument with a friend, and you know, a certain perspective doesn't seem to make any sense and they're really frustrated, you don't have to get into the nitty-gritty of the argument and whether the logical buildup was true or false or anything. You can just say, you know, if I heard that, I would be really frustrated too. Or you can just say, I see that you're really frustrated. Reflect that emotion back to them. It goes a long way for them to know that they're being heard and understood. Also, during stressful times, it's really important to offer additional affection, even to those kids who are not always open to it. Still being available and still letting them know that your hugs and your cuddles are available to them. And one-on-one time with parents is really important. I know it's hard to come by, but it's important to build in a little extra, a little more than usual during times of stress. And also make space for silence and alone time for everyone, for the kids and the adults. We all need some of that time to just recharge. Introverts need a lot more of it than extroverts do, but extroverts need it too. We all do. Also, kids learn from our modeling. They're watching us. They see us experiencing our own stress, and that impacts them. And so that can put extra pressure on us, like, oh, what do? I have to make sure I'm managing my stress, which is true, but we don't have to hide it. This is actually an opportunity for us to model how we cope. We don't have to pretend that we're not stressed. We don't have to pretend that we're not worried about the world or whatever it is that's going on for you in a moment. This is actually an opportunity to verbalize explicitly in front of them and to show them how we deal with it. So if my kid walks into the kitchen and can see in my body language and in my face that I'm really stressed as I'm reading the news, and I see them kind of bristle as they see my stress, I might say to them, hey, you know what? This news is kind of worrying me right now. I'm worried about it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the information I need, and then I'm going to put it down. And I'm also going to take some deep breaths to soften my muscle tension and take a break from this and do something else. So when we say that out loud, when we walk through the process of our own coping, whatever that looks like in that moment, but we walk through it out loud in front of our kids, and we're not necessarily instructing them on what they should do. We're just saying, here's what I'm feeling, here's what I'm going to do about it. Then they learn through modeling that that's something they can do on their own time as well. When they show signs of stress, I want to point out that we can't problem solve during meltdown moments. The brain just doesn't work that way. When we're in that fight, flight, or freeze response, the amygdala kind of hijacks the prefrontal cortex. The emotional part of our brain takes over the thinking part of our brain. And so we're not in a good position to be able to problem solve during a meltdown. We can problem solve later. We can reflect back on it. We can figure out all of the things. But in that moment is not a time for problem solving. That's a time for self-regulation. That's a time for maybe sitting with the emotion, maybe coping through some breathing or some yoga or some other strategies. But a really important point for your kids' meltdowns is that you don't have to fix them. Those are their meltdowns. It's their emotion. You don't have to fix it. You can be available to them. I do recommend doing that, showing up for them, being available as a resource to help provide comfort, to help problem solve maybe, but you don't have to fix it. And especially with our middle school kids, when we try to fix it, that can actually amplify the emotion. And so sometimes it helps to support from behind the scenes. I'd also suggest resist the temptation to swoop in and rescue, because that takes away their opportunity to show their own resilience to themselves. And we want them to have those experiences because those will snowball in the best way possible. When they show to themselves that they have mastery over these challenging situations, then they feel more confident, and the next time one comes along, they're better prepared to meet that challenge. We also want to help build in some recovery time. When there is a meltdown or an outburst or some kind of emotional release, maybe an argument, we want them to have some time to really reset after that. And one thing we can point out to them is you may not have any control over the stressor that happened. The thing that caused all of this emotion might have been completely out of your hands. What you do have control over in this moment is how you reset and how you comfort yourself afterward, how you refill that resilience tank. And so letting them have some control in that process is really helpful. They might need to talk about it. Some kids do, some kids don't, and some kids change it up in different situations. So they might need to really talk it out, or it might be better for them not to. They might just be ready to move on. And let's also think about that demands and resources imbalance. Is it possible to lower the demands of a certain situation or increase the resources in some way? So we might want to think about, especially during this time of repeated chronic stress, of lowering the pressure. Here's one thing that seems to be universally true about gifted kids. When they hear the phrase, give it your best, or try your best, or do your best, what they hear is your best ever. Give it your best ever that you've ever given. And that might not be realistic during times of chronic stress. What we want to reframe and recalibrate is to think about, give it the best that you can under the current circumstances. Given your current resources, given what you have available to you right now, what's your best now? It doesn't have to be the best ever. And it might not even be your best now. Is it okay to operate at 90% effort level or 80% effort level? I mean, we're all just kind of surviving right now. So lowering the pressure, lowering the demands might be one way to help balance out that stress. A few other tips for building resilience. There are two major factors that contribute to anxiety that can kind of take us from this place of stress to anxiety. And that's when something is not predictable and when something is not within our control. Predictability and controllability are ways of helping manage stress so that it doesn't flip over into anxiety. So what we can do with kids is to help cultivate this sense of predictability and sense of control. Predictability comes with consistent expectations, consistent routines, and maybe some rituals, maybe a certain sequence of how the morning goes, your morning ritual, or a certain sequence at bedtime. You've got your bedtime rituals. That consistency there is what brings predictability. They know what to expect, they know what's coming, and that brings some psychological safety. The control, giving kids choice wherever possible. And sometimes it might be a really limited choice. You might be giving them a menu or, a multiple choice option of just 2 or 3 things to choose from, whether it's a dinner choice and maybe not the whole dinner. Maybe they just get to choose which vegetable are we having tonight. And you only give them a couple to choose from. But having that sense, when kids have a sense that they can make their own choices, then they feel a little more in control of things. And the way things are right now with COVID procedures and unpredictability of are we in school or are we out of school, and the constant adaptation, and there's so much that's out of their control, there is so much that's unpredictable, that we want to try to cultivate this predictability and controllability as much as we can, even if it's with little things. Other things that build resilience are play. Yes, play. Screen-free is really important, and self-directed play. So self-directed means that it's not a coach telling them to do these drills, and it's not parents or teachers or friends saying you have to play this certain game. Self-directed is when they really just have free time to choose what they do with their play. And all kids need this, all kids, every age. I would argue that adults probably need it too. We also want to teach them healthy self-care. So self-care is a really critical component of resilience. When we're thinking about that demands outweighing resources, we can fill up our resources with self-care. And that includes the basics: nutrition, hydration, getting enough sleep. I cannot overemphasize how important sleep is. Getting good quality sleep on a consistent basis fills that resilience tank a lot. Consistent physical activity is really important for resilience. Connection with loved ones, even if that's virtual, that's okay. Having that time to talk with meaningful people in their lives. And opportunities for valued and meaningful activities. And I know a lot of these have been taken away from a lot of kids. Some of the things that they love to do have not been options. And so maybe finding other new meaningful activities can be helpful. Another thing is for parents, taking care of you. This is critical. It has been said you cannot pour from an empty cup, and it is so true. If you are depleted, if your resilience tank is empty, then it is pretty impossible to show up for our kids. And so thinking about, we can think about it in the service of our kids, of their mental health, their social and emotional skills. But really, even if it's not for our kids, we need it. We need our own wellness. We need our own resilience, especially during these really stressful times. So self-care is very, very important. Again, going back to those basics of nutrition, hydration, exercise, connection with others. Sometimes in our society, we tend to think of self-care as like a bubble bath or a retreat on a mountain where, we have all of these spa services or something. It doesn't have to be that. Self-care can simply be, I am going to sit down to eat my meal and not work while I have lunch. And sorry that we're doing this lunchtime thing. This kind of defeats the purpose, but just kidding. But really saying, I'm going to dedicate this time for me. Sometimes, maybe it's a simple thing as spending an extra 5 minutes in the shower where you are alone and you can think and you can just have a moment to yourself. Self-care is really important, and it's important for it to be consistent, not just one big thing once a month, but daily care for your basic needs and some extra too. Healthy coping strategies are really important. Avoidance coping is kind of the easy go-to when we're extra stressed. So avoidance coping can be like avoiding a coworker we don't want to talk to because there's conflict. Or it can be avoiding a problem and ignoring it and hoping it'll go away. But avoidance can also be other things like overindulging in alcohol or over-exercising or overworking. There are a lot of ways that we kind of check out from what's really in front of us. And that doesn't work in the long run. It might give us a momentary reprieve, but in the long run, it doesn't help, and it won't serve to fill that resilience tank. And just keeping in mind that parenting is an incredibly stressful endeavor, and that's even more true now than it ever has been. So it's extra important to think about, there are more demands on us that have increased our stress levels. And so thinking about that inequality, how do we balance out the resources to meet the demands? We need more of this, more self-care, more healthy coping. So I just want to spend a little time thinking about when is it more than stress? When do we need to be on the lookout for, we've reached the point where my kid is not just stressed, but is kind of beyond that and needs additional help. So first of all, we want to identify when stress levels are rising. And we can think about accumulated stress too, not just the big stressors, but also the little stressors can really add up. And so we want to be tuned into those. Their accumulation can be harder to detect, especially for the kids who don't share a whole lot with us. We might not know that these things are adding up. And so oftentimes the way that we find out that the accumulated stress has happened is that they blow up over something really small. And we don't understand. And it seems disproportionate. But sometimes that really small thing is actually the 117th really small thing. And so that can be a clue for us to dig a little deeper and find out what else has been happening. Observe their mood and behavior. This is another reason that we have to put down the phone and put down the laptop and really plug in, is so that we know their baseline. We kind of know their patterns in terms of mood and behavior, so that when it changes, we're able to catch that. It's important to know the difference between normative stress versus depression or anxiety. I'm going to give you a warning list to look out for on the next slide. But also keep in mind that sadness and anxiety are somewhat normative, especially during stressful times. So we don't want to over-pathologize, but we also still want to keep an eye out for the red flags. So here are the red flags. When you see dramatic changes in emotional responses. So if you have a kid who is always quick-tempered, that's not a change in emotional responses. That's kind of their norm. That's their baseline. But if they become more quick-tempered than usual, that's a change, and that's something we want to pay attention to. Frequent crying or intense or persistent distress. Apathy is a big one. Apathy is one that we really want to pay attention to, especially if they're a kid who really, really, really used to care about something and now all of a sudden they don't. That's something that we probably want to check into. A sense of hopelessness is a concern. If a kid seems really hopeless, that can be a sign of depression that we definitely don't want to let go. Change in appetite. This one is tricky for a growing child because appetite changes all the time. And so it's hard for this to be an indicator by itself, but when this one is matched with other indicators, that's when we might be concerned. And that can be an increase in appetite or a decrease in appetite. Change in sleep quality or sleep quantity, if they're sleeping a lot more than usual or they're waking up during the night all the time, and this is new for them, that's something we want to look into. A loss of interest in valued activities, that kind of goes along with apathy in a way. Withdrawing from loved ones, especially if that used to be a source of positivity and hope and connection for them. Frequent stomach aches or headaches or other physical symptoms. Self-injurious behavior is something that needs professional help. If a kiddo is cutting or burning or doing other self-destructive behaviors, then that's definitely something that we should take to a therapist. Physical aggression, again, especially if that's different for them, is a reason to look into extra help. Lying to teachers or parents, significant drop in grades, or refusing to go to school. These are some things that you would probably want to catch early, and there are lower level interventions such as talking to the teacher, talking to me, things that we can probably do here at school to help with those kinds of things. But if it gets to a point where it's really significant, then we would want to look for extra help. And of course, if there's any substance abuse, with the kids Sycamore ages, we don't tend to think of substance abuse as a direction they would go, and I'll cross my fingers that's true, but it's not out of the possibility. When to pursue counseling, so when any of those warning signs are present. And in my opinion, of course I'm biased, I think there's never a bad time for counseling. It's always helpful. And I'm talking to you as parents, I'm talking to you about your kids and about yourselves. I always think it's helpful to talk to someone who has no skin in the game. They are not invested in you making this decision versus that decision. They don't care about the outcome, really. They just care about your well-being. And so that it can be really helpful to have that objective perspective. Counseling is especially important when there are functional disruptions. So if functioning is not going well in one way or another, that's a good time for additional intervention. And one thing to point out about counseling, especially if it's new to you or new to your family, is that the relationship is so important. I can't stress this enough. The relationship has more to do with, the relationship predicts outcome more than any other variable. And so it's important that the kiddo feel like they can trust the therapist, that they feel understood by the therapist, and it takes a little time for that relationship to develop. So I would recommend sticking it out for a few sessions to see how it goes. But if it's not going well, if there's not a trusting relationship developing, then it might be time to look for someone else. Of course, if there's any concern about suicidal thoughts or self-injurious behavior, there are additional resources. So I wanted to give you guys this crisis hotline information. It's available at all times. And there's a texting option too. I should have put that on there. I'm sorry that I didn't, but there is a textable crisis line as well. So in conclusion, our kiddos are extremely resilient in and of themselves, but we can also help support and help cultivate their strengths so that they can meet everyday stressors as well as the intense and ongoing stressors that they've been experiencing over the past year. So what questions do you guys have? I have not been watching the chat, so I don't know if there are questions there.
I've watched the chat, and so far we have no questions.
Okay. So if anyone wants to unmute and ask a question, or if you want to type a question into the chat, I am happy to address those. I also have my contact information here if you'd like to give me a call or send me an email.
So there's a question. Have you noticed increased stress for the kids this year versus what you consider normal over the years?
Yes, yes. Yes, very, very much so. I have seen this across the board, across all ages, and there has been more need for counseling this year than ever. And the issues that kids have brought have been a bit more serious, a bit more intense than what's typical. So, you have kiddos who are worried about getting sick with coronavirus, kids who are worried about taking it home to their households, kids who are stressed because they worry that they didn't make academic gains during distance learning and they're not sure how, if they've fallen behind. We've kind of passed that phase now. I think everybody's more settled in, but when we first came back from distance learning, that was a concern. And so I do think that there's been increased stress. I also think there's been increased resilience. I mean, I think our kids are coping really well, and they have supportive teachers and supportive peers. And I have seen kids reach out to each other and show up for each other and be there for one another. And so it has been a really intense, stressful time. But I've also seen some silver linings from that as well.